thanks for inviting me, future STEM leaders. You know, I'll tell you an interesting story. I went to MIT undergraduate, and when we graduated from MIT, at MIT usually the commencement speaker is the president of MIT, not an outside person. And so there's like, you know, I don't know, 1,200 of us in my undergraduate class, and you know, we're all sitting there, and the guy says, "You are the leaders of tomorrow." I'm like, what? Anyway, so you are the leaders of tomorrow, no lie. I didn't realize that till later, but it's true. So what I want to talk about today, I'll just tell you who I am and what I've done, and then when we're done, you can just ask me questions. So I call this from Venn diagrams to public health. Okay? So you guys study Venn diagrams in school? I was a math major at MIT. Every single class started with Venn diagrams. I have no idea why. They just did. So anyway, so I do want to talk about, long before you guys were born, how I became an operations researcher. What is that? What have I done in research? Some thoughts about career success, and can you have it all? That's maybe more toward the women, but whatever. So long ago, back in the mists of time, I was an undergraduate student at MIT. There I am. I found my yearbook picture. And excuse me. As I mentioned, I was a math major. It turns out I actually saved a couple of my notebooks. Look at that nice, neat handwriting and my graphs and stuff. I know. This is before, you know, laptops and everything, so you basically wrote everything down by hand. Anyway, so I was a math major, and I really enjoyed that. And I majored in math because I really like math, and because I think it's generic. Mathematics is one of the languages of science. So, for example, I'm a professor of engineering at Stanford now, and also a professor of medicine. And I can go to almost any PhD dissertation defense in engineering and kind of have a sense of what they're talking about, because I know math. Like, I may not know about airplane wings and how to design them, but I understand if you're showing me some math about how I design my wing. So that's why I picked math as a major. I was looking back through my notebooks. So I'm what you would call an operations researcher. So I'm in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering at Stanford, okay? And have you guys heard of operations research? It's basically applied mathematical systems analysis. It's how you solve large-scale complex problems systematically, and often using mathematics. And I looked back through my notebooks, and I remember distinctly the day I realized that that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know it had a name. I was just a math major. The professor was just talking about stuff. But I thought, this is so cool. So I looked back through my notebooks, and it turned out, I actually, you know, had dated the date in the notebook. It was September 4th, 1974, because I found my notebook. What was happening in the world then? Watergate scandal was happening. Fleetwood Mac was the top band. Blazing Saddles was the top movie. And I decided to become an operations researcher. So I actually found my notebook pages from that day, okay? So I was taking this class called Principles of Applied Mathematics. And basically, it's talking about how you have a large complex problem, how do you solve it? Like for example, this is, you have a list of numbers and you want to sort them. This is a well-known problem in computer science. Like, I just gave you a random list and you want to sort this in some way, alphabetically, numerically, whatever you like. Well, there's lots of ways you could think about that. You could think about pairwise interchange. I just work my way through the list, and let's say I want my numbers smaller to larger. You just flip them, and you put the smaller one first, okay? You go through the list, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again, until all the numbers are in order, okay? You know, from smallest to largest. But there's lots of other ways to do it. And that got me really excited, thinking about, oh, so you can count up how many steps on average it will take you, and you can figure out a more efficient way to do it. And in fact, that's what computer scientists spend a lot of time doing now. So that was an example of a problem. Another good example, have any of you all heard of linear programming? I'm going to tell you a story which illustrates linear programming. Suppose you're making cars and motorcycles, and you're making them out of nuts, bolts, and screws, okay? And I'm telling you that each car requires 4 nuts, 5 bolts, and 1 screw. And each car sells for $8, okay? Each motorcycle requires 2 nuts, obviously a super generic example, super stylized, 3 bolts, and a half a screw. I don't know what a half a screw is, but who cares? And sells for $B. And I have 20 nuts, 30 bolts, and 25 screws. how can I use the nuts, bolts, and screws that I have to maximize my profit? Well, this particular problem, you could solve it right now. I mean, just get a pencil and paper. But if you start asking, like, I have 20 super tankers to take crude oil, to go pick up crude oil, take it to the refineries. Where should I send those super tankers? That's exactly what this problem is. In that case, you want to minimize cost while still picking up the oil. So that's an example of a large-scale optimization problem, and it turns out that there's a method called linear programming. It's actually invented at Stanford in my department long ago that will solve that problem. And in fact, your Excel, when you use Excel, Excel solver uses linear programming, if that's the kind of problem you put into it. Anyway, and then there's also, say, networking problems. I don't know how many of you have heard of the shortest path problem. I want to get from point A to point B through a network. What's the shortest path? So lots of cool problems. So I decided, so I was a math major, and I realized, oh, I'm more interested in applied math and applied math applied to systems problems. So, so what happened? So I was an undergraduate at MIT math major. So I decided to do a master's in this new thing I found out was called operations research. We didn't have a department called operations research. We just had like a program, and it turned out I'd already taken half the classes. So then you had to do a thesis, okay? So I stayed like to do co-terminal masters. So my master's thesis was about interline subway control systems. And basically, so this is an example, this is a picture of the subway in Boston, the T it's called. And subways go up to a station and you get off and then you walk upstairs to get on the red line or whatever it is. Well, the question you could ask is, how long should you hold subway trains? If you know another train's pulling in upstairs with hundreds of people, maybe you should wait a minute and let those people get on your train. So that's a nice example of a math problem that we can solve. So I did that, and then I guess I kind of already said that, but to do it, I went and actually measured the arrival times of the subway trains, met a lot of hobos. You know, like, why are you hanging around the subway stop all day? Measure, you know, arrival times of new riders, develop a cost model for waiting time, and then figure out the best holding strategies. Okay, so a math problem. So my first page, so I got my co-terminal masters, and I went to work for this company that my advisor was running, my MIT professor and a couple other professors, called Public Systems Evaluation. And what we did, we're a nonprofit public sector consulting company, and we just used our operations research skills to help public agencies solve their complex problems. So my first job was to redeploy ambulances for the city of Boston. So at the time, the city of Boston was on the front page of the Boston Globe the ambulance system was on the front page of the Boston Globe every day because the drivers would rob you, and the ambulances had vomit in them, and you know, scandal page every day. So part of the city health commissioners like, get us off the front page of the Globe. You know, this is bad. So part of it was, there was a little bit of research money to look at how to redeploy the ambulances. Where should the home bases be? So I don't know if you've noticed, there's often an ambulance at your local firehouse. There's an ambulance over at Stanford Hospital. There's ambulances in different places around town. So where should they be located for the city of Boston? Okay, their home bases. So to do this, I got all the data for the city of Boston ambulance calls for the last year by census tract. How long does it take to travel between each of these locations? How long do each of these calls take for the ambulance? What is the best way to have the best home bases for our ambulances? So that was my first job, okay? So I did this, and then I decided to, so I had my master's, and I decided that in the company, you couldn't be the boss unless you had a PhD or an MBA, and I want to be the boss, honestly. And so for me, I thought an MBA is more of a general management type of degree. I'd probably be a lot richer if I had one, but hey. So I decided to come to Stanford to a long ago incarnation of the department I'm in now, called the Department of Engineering and Economic Systems, and get a PhD. So I did a number of projects when I was a graduate student. For example, I looked at a clinical problem. There's so-called fecal occult blood tests. That's where someone takes a sample of their feces and you check to see if there's blood in it. Because if there's blood in your stool, that's a super bad thing, and sometimes means you have colorectal cancer. So suppose someone has a positive test. It could be false positive. How should you follow up? is usually false positive, in fact. So we estimated the probabilities of different things happening. We used the decision tree, different tests, to figure out what was the best sequence. So that's an example. Another example, when I was a grad student, I worked at Stanford Hospital doing planning. So an interesting problem, which is actually a linear program, is what is the right mix of patients to maximize your contribution to fixed expense, subject to available resources, like the number of beds I have, the demand for different things, et cetera. So we looked at, well, how many beds do you have, how many nurses, how many patients are in the system, and then we used a linear program. So that's an example of actually applied linear programming. I also did some work in manufacturing at Hewlett-Packard. So Hewlett-Packard was making printed circuit boards, and some of the printed circuit boards are replacement boards. Some of them they're going to put on a machine, and some they're going to do by hand. So the question is what you should put on the machine. Again, that's a large-scale mathematical optimization program that you can't figure out just by looking at it. It's too complicated. So, we looked at what is the demand, what kind of machine or manual needs do you have, and we used an integer program, which is a special case of linear programming. And then we also developed some useful heuristics. So anyway, so I mentioned that I've worked in a variety of areas: facility, location, network modeling, automated guided vehicle networks, optimal component commonality. These are some other manufacturing problems I worked on. Oh, and then I took a right turn to AIDS. Or was it a left turn? Right turn? I'm not sure which. So this was back in 1980 something, 86, 87. And I realized that there was an opportunity for us to use the same kind of mathematical analyses to look at the HIV epidemic. And I know my dean of engineering at a dinner one day, he said to me, "So Margaret, what does engineering have to do with AIDS?" I'm like, let me tell you. Anyway, so as you may know, in the HIV epidemic, there's tens of millions of people infected, 33, 34, 35 million people, something like that. About 2 million deaths per year, and the largest epidemic in the history of mankind. The problem is, and most of the cases, if you look here, the 22 million of those 33 are in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is we don't have enough funds for prevention and treatment. So you have to figure out what you're going to do with your limited resources. So you can ask yourself, well, what should we do to prevent? How should we allocate scarce treatment funds? And how should we allocate resources between prevention and treatment? These are mathematical problems that you can approach using the tools of operations research. So some of my current research, I'm working on HIV prevention and treatment, hepatitis B, bioterror preparedness, drug abuse prevention and treatment. So I'm going to show you one slide on each of these. So concurrent partnership distribution, so that's about, imagine a network of people. So the way HIV spreads is you have to have sexual contact with someone, or needle sharing contact, or get a blood transfusion. But let's say sexual and needle sharing contact. So that's a network among people. Those are relationships. People are nodes of the network, and their relationships are the links. So you can model concurrent partnerships. That means when someone has like a wife and a girlfriend, or a boyfriend and a sugar daddy type of thing. So true, all true. I can tell you all about sugar daddies later. So it turns out, though, that's a super efficient way to spread disease, because if someone is having sex with two different people, you get HIV from one person, you spread it to the next one super quick. So we did a study of, so they have these programs about, I choose to have only one partner. You might want these material things, but do you need HIV? Say no to sugar daddies. And so we looked at what effect concurrent partnership reduction could have on the HIV epidemic. So that's one of the things they're trying in parts of Africa, is like, don't have two sex partners, because that's just the perfect way to get HIV. And we used a network microsimulation model to look at that. One of my PhD students did that. HIV control in Eastern Europe. You may not know this, but HIV, the place that's growing fastest in the world is Eastern Europe. It's the largest prevalence. This is sort of a heat map of prevalence. Down here is where there are the most cases, but the largest number of new cases is in Russia and countries of the former Soviet Union. So, and that's because of injection drug use primarily. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, lots of heroin use in Russia, sex workers spread it to other people, They've really avoided treating. And so we did a study of looking at, well, if you could treat the injection drug users with methadone maintenance. So you know what methadone is? That's when someone's addicted to heroin, and instead of being addicted to heroin, they take methadone every day. They're not high. It binds to the opiate receptors in the brain, so they're not high, and they can function. Although some would argue they're addicted to methadone. So that, or getting more people onto treatment. And the thing about HIV treatment is it makes the person live longer, but it also makes them far less infectious. So it not only helps them, but it helps everyone else. So it's a form of prevention. And so we've done a lot of studies looking at how you should allocate resources between prevention programs and treatment programs. I took my sabbatical a couple of years ago in Geneva, Switzerland. My son was going to gun high school, and he got to live in Switzerland for a year, go to the International School of Geneva. So he was super lucky. My other two sons were in college. They're like, Mom, come on, we don't get to go? But anyway, I worked with the United Nations AIDS program on developing a spreadsheet model to help countries think about these difficult questions. So it's a resource allocation model that decision makers can use in their countries. Hepatitis B control. Do you guys know what hepatitis B is? It's a disease that affects the liver. You get it, it's bloodborne. A child typically gets it from their mother by being born to an infected mother, but it can also be like among children from cuts and scrapes and all. So we've done some projects on helping the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention think about, should we screen, should we vaccinate, what should we do? Again, math problem. We've looked at catch-up vaccination in China. I worked with Sam So, who runs the Asian Liver Center at Stanford. He's a surgery professor. Catch-up vaccination is when you go into the schools and you vaccinate the children. And the Chinese government changed their vaccination guidelines. That was pretty cool. And educational programs, and just generally control of other kinds of hepatitis as well. There's also hepatitis C, which is mostly spread by injection drug use. So math problems. Okay, bioterrorism preparedness. So this is about, thinking about, what if there's a bioterror attack in the US? What if there's an anthrax attack? Remember the letters in 2001, the Amerithrax letters? We've done some modeling on the supply chain for response. Finally, the last one I'm working on is diversion programs for drug offenders. So you can see how I'm a long, long way from Venn diagrams now, and this is the farthest. So you guys know there's an opioid epidemic happening in the US right now, right? Did you know that Vermont is the heroin capital of the US? The reason that is we have a lot of opioid pain pills out there. Oxycodone, hydrocodone. People get addicted. And people who are addicted, they steal grandma's pills. Maybe they can't get a prescription, can't get the pills easily, they become heroin addicts. It's cheaper and easier. It's also stupid, but and very, very deadly. But this is among white middle-class people who have some political clout. So you have people in Vermont whose 20-year-old kid is a heroin addict, and they say, my son is not a criminal, my son needs help. So we've seen a bit of a change in the US. We don't want to lock these people up as much. And by the way, did you know that our prisons are filled with crack cocaine offenders? These were historically underrepresented minorities who had no voice, really. But anyway, I think people are starting to realize that drug addiction is actually a social problem. So we are working with this program in Seattle called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program. And you can tell this is Seattle because A, it's raining, and B, the guy's on his bike, so he's all friendly. But the basic idea, these are like this is an actual picture, a couple of drug users out on the street. The basic idea is they get these people into treatment. They get them the help they need. Okay, so instead of locking them up and putting them into court, or sending them to court, putting them to jail and possibly prison, they say, you know what, you need drug treatment, you need housing and psychological services, you don't need to be locked up. So that's what this program is. It's a pilot program. So I mentioned that. And it turns out there are fewer jail days per individual, much less likely to be rearrested. You save a lot of money on court costs, okay? But this is great for public safety and social justice, and what we're doing is we're modeling the public health benefits of this. So if someone isn't using drugs, they're not spreading HIV and hepatitis C to other people. they're not creating a lot of health expenditures, okay? So, anyway, so I've given you a very, very high-level overview of how I went from Venn diagrams to diversion programs for drug offenders. But I think the underlying theme here in all of this is you're using the tools of mathematical systems analysis. So, especially for women, but I think this is for everyone here, thoughts about career success. So I think for any of you, if you want to be successful as a scientist and a researcher, is to work on important problems. If you work on a problem that no one cares about, not going to have any impact. Work on problems that you find interesting, work with people you like. This is from long experience. I work with some people I didn't like, don't do that. Focus on excellence. I can't emphasize this enough. Even if no one is looking at what you do, make it excellent. That is a strategy that pays off in the long run. I think also you gotta be your own best judge. So I told you how the Dean of Engineering is like, Margaret, what does engineering have to do with AIDS? I'm like, just trust me. So even though everyone thought I was crazy, like now they're like, you had so much foresight. And I'm like, well, I thought it was a good idea and I stuck with it. And then, well, maybe this is just my own personal psychology, but learn to say no. I think you can often have lots and lots of opportunities in your life. Oh, here's a really good book, The Power of a Positive No. And it's really about focusing your efforts on things you care about, okay? So last point I wanna make, can you have it all? Maybe this is more relevant for women, I don't know. The answer is no, you cannot have it all, okay? And I don't mean you can't have a lot, but you can't have it all, I think. So, okay, so here's me, you know, lots of stuff on my plate. So I'm working hard, I'm going on trips. I just got back from a trip yesterday. I have 3 sons, there they are, they're a little bit older now, but my 3 sons, they all went to gun high school. I have a husband. Oh, I like to work out sometimes. And so like lots of parts of my life, and I really think that it's all about just finding the right balance. It's all about figuring out what is the right balance in your life for all of these things. So I do think you can have almost everything, but you know, there's always going to be trade-offs. Maybe that's learning to say no. So in conclusion, I found this nice quote. It was on a webpage of inspirational quotes, but I still like it despite the fact, you know, sometimes those are not so good. But the road of life twists and turns, no two directions are the same, yet our lessons come from the journey, not the destination. So I think that's good words to think about. You don't know where you're going. Just do what you think is right at each point in time. Do what you think is interesting. Be as excellent as you can. Have confidence in yourself. And then good things will happen, I hope. So that's all I have to say. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
What was the answer to the subway problem that you did?
The answer was that within a certain time window, if you knew that another train was arriving, and I figured out what that cutoff was, you should wait for the train. So I pull into Park Street Station in the red line, and I know the blue line is coming, or maybe it's the green, within 2 minutes. If it's within 2 minutes or some cutoff, then you wait. If not, you don't wait. So it's basically a cutoff. Yes?
So I don't know anything about quantum computers, but I'm wondering if your kind of math is part of that. Because I know there's like one famous quantum computer problem with like the mailman going around the entire city.
Well, no, we don't use quantum computing, and quantum computing is a promise. Some of the problems that I have talked about are so-called NP-hard problems, and that means they're non-polynomial. It means that like the traveling salesman problem, what's the shortest way to visit 10 cities? That's a so-called NP-hard problem. You can, the answer is like 10 factorial or n factorial. You have to figure out which one is first, which one is second, which one is third.
Yeah.
So there's 10 possibilities for the first place you could visit and 9 for the second, etc. So the idea behind quantum computing, which this premise has not yet been realized, but some people hope, is that maybe by having a totally different kind of computing, we could get completely around the whole problem of that is associated with ordinary digital computers solving large-scale problems like that. So that's an example of a problem they would like to solve. I mean, I know there's a lot of research being done on it, but what I've seen so far is lots of promise. We shall see. You know, lots of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes?
What does your day-to-day look like?
Well, I've been traveling quite a lot recently. I had the opportunity to go to a university in Chile a couple weeks ago. So I took a week off and went hiking in Patagonia with one of my sons. And I just got back from a conference yesterday. I went to annual conference of our Operations Research Society. So just came home yesterday. But typical day for me, as much as possible, I work at home in the morning, because to do what we do, you have to be able to think quietly. This is not lab work where you hang around the lab and you collaborate necessarily. A lot of it involves just thinking about the problem, writing articles, okay? So I work at home in the morning, and then I often go over to Stanford in the afternoon. I try to work out 3 or 4 times a week, either hiking or swimming. I usually out of the office by 5 or 6 if I go over to the office. Then I go home and try to convince my one son to cook dinner. I have a boomerang child who lives at home. So it's kind of variable, but, and in the afternoon when I'm at Stanford, I teach classes. I meet with PhD students. I'm associate chair of our department. So a real variety of things that I do. Meet with students, meet with colleagues. I just now came from a meeting of a faculty search committee. I'm gonna go right after this and meet with a PhD student. I have to teach class at 4 o'clock. You know, but all good things. You know, I mean, the way I'm saying it, you're thinking, oh my God, it sounds so stressful, but these are all good things. So,
Do you
sorry, go ahead.
like working at Stanford?
I think it's great. You know, I think I mentioned the reason I got a PhD is so I could become the boss of the consulting company.
Yeah.
And so I was never planning to be a professor. And my husband, who I met at our PhD program at Stanford, was always planning to be a professor. And it turned out when we were finishing our PhDs, I said, Joe, do you like working on your thesis? He goes, oh my God, I hate that more than anything in the world. I'm like, you probably shouldn't be a professor. So he actually went and he eventually became vice president of Microsoft. And he was also vice president of Adobe Software. So, which was good for us, so he could make some money. But but I kind of fell into it by mistake, but I realized that for me, it's a fantastic job. You get to be around smart people all day long. As a professor at Stanford anyway, you have a great deal of autonomy. Like, again, I'm looking at diversion programs for drug offenders. You're like, what does that have to do with engineering? So you set the agenda of what you think is important. So I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes?
Does the same go for MIT?
In what way?
The teaching styles versus the freedom as you were describing?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I know many faculty members there.
Okay.
I think most top research universities are that way, especially private research universities. Yes?
What advice would you have for high schoolers trying to figure out what they want to do?
I would say be open, take classes that you think are cool. Don't commit yourself to a major too early. Like, I didn't know what operations research was. I just started taking these applied math classes, because at MIT there's no department of operations research or anything, so I didn't even know that was a major. Well, it wasn't a major, but I didn't even know you could get a master's in it. It was just because I took classes. I also think that you should just take anything you find interesting. So when I was an undergrad, every single quarter, or we were on semesters, I took a literature class because I like to read. And I also took film classes, and when I was a grad student, I took game theory and just stuff from all over the place. I learned to speak Spanish, which is actually good because when I was in Chile, I was giving my talks in Spanish. So I think my advice would be don't commit to a major too early and just take whatever you think is interesting. So I found the path to being a professor, but nobody in my family is a professor. My dad went to MIT, but he was a patent lawyer. You know, everyone in my family is like a lawyer or a doctor. Nobody's a professor. So I didn't even know that was like a cool thing to do. But in retrospect, I realized I was like the perfect person to be a professor, because like whenever I took a class, I'd be like, I'm getting an A, I don't care what. You know, because like I really wanted to master subjects, you know. So I think just to take what you find is interesting, and then you'll kind of find your way. You can't possibly know in high school what you're gonna do, right? So I think it's just to be open and be okay with that. A lot of people, some of my Stanford students are like, what? I can't take all material science classes, but that's what I want to study. I'm like, well, that's not how it's set up here, and it's good to try other things. Anyway, thank you so much for coming.